Shalom and greetings again, friends. For those of you out there who have watched my part 1 of this video teaching titled Elul 29 and the fourth blood moon, which the fourth blood moon is coming up in just about a day or so from the recording of this video teaching, I want to thank all of you who've watched it. And for you Hebrews out there, as we say in Hebrew, Todah Rabbah. And I hope as many or more out there will listen to this video teaching as well, and listen carefully. For you Hebrews out there, Shema Israel. Because I have some more things to say here to add to it. And I also have another prophecy possibility coming up soon here to share with you. I'm excited to share this with you. A possibility, like I said, in regard to the final feast day, the final rest day. We can say Sabbath. Some of us say Sabbath or Shabbat. Many of us know it as the 8th day. It's the day right after Sukkot, the 7 days of Sukkot or Tabernacles. The 8th day is also known as the Judgment Day, or it's symbolic of a future judgment and a great white throne judgment, as we will see. And I'll share with that later in this video teaching some interesting things and how sometimes, our Creator, He thinks in cycles, in circles, not such a linear mindset as so many out there have, but we see in His creation, He likes anniversaries. He likes to see history repeat itself. Even the abomination of desolation, we see that happening a number of times with the destruction of the first temple, the second temple. We even have the whole Hanukkah story, right? Antiochus Epiphanes coming in and the abomination of desolation, a statue being set up there, and unclean animals being sacrificed in the temple, and it had to be cleansed and desecrated. It was desecrated. Anyway, long story short, we see history kind of repeating itself, and it intensifies. And something I'll share with you later on in this video teaching. But I want to welcome, first of all comments or questions, even on this video teaching. I even allow, as you notice on some of my other video teachings on YouTube, I allow disagreements, respectful disagreements, I should say, and even diverse opinions. But let me warn everyone again that I do remove comments that have derogatory, like put down insulting comments, and profanity. It should be obvious, but I get some of that even. Inappropriate postings, whether it be images or videos. I've had to remove some things like that. And I'll give you an example, though, of an inappropriate comment in my last teaching on this. This is part 1. I had one comment where a fellow out there said, called me an effing wannabe, or he said, effing Christian wannabe Jew. And I'm not going to say the exact word for the F word, okay? I hope you understand. Or he might have said, called me an effing Jew or wannabe Christian, one of the two. So definitely an anti-Semitic comment I had to remove very quickly. Or definitely not a good example of someone who's observing the Torah, the written Torah. And even in the oral law, Hillel, those of you who know Hillel, the Golden Rule, he even taught that even before Yeshua, a.k.a. Jesus, came in the flesh. He said the Golden Rule is to love your neighbors yourself. It comes right from Devarim. It comes right from the writings of Moshe, to love others as you love yourself, or treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And we got to set that good example, whether it be in the Torah or in the Brit Hadashah. Plenty of commentary in the New Testament on how to love your brothers, love even your enemies. Yeshua said to love them, pray for them. And, we're trying to win people over through love more than attacking and and returning evil for evil, or even just getting revenge. So we have a higher standard under the Brit Hadashah, but I do remove comments like that. And nevertheless, let me get down to the topic here at hand. Part 2 is there's not much bad has happened since Elul 29 this year, September 14th of this year, 2015 CE. Nothing really bad has happened to the U.S. economy. We see little signs and signals here. Nothing bad to the soil of this country, of America. So, not that any of us want that. I hope none of us are just really wanting all this as an attack and revenge on a bad society or a Sodom and Gomorrah. But if it's His will, we want to be ready. But many Messianics and even some in Hebrew roots are starting to get feeble knees. Like, oh, nothing's happened. Maybe His feast days don't mean anything anymore. It's, and people are even mocking us. I read an article on Israel Today where a Christian writer was mocking these feast days and trying to say that we're proclaiming that the world's coming to an end. Well, I'm not saying the world's coming to an end in this September, October. And Jonathan Cahn, he's just saying there's a harbinger. There's warnings coming. It could be 7, 14, 21 years from now. But we're not setting dates for the return of the Messiah. And I want to make that real clear. But there are warning signs that we should take note of. And almost all the main events, even in the New Testament, occur around the holy days, the annual feast days of the Lord, of the Creator here, Adonai. He likes these days, and whether things happen on them or not, it shouldn't discourage us on what the Scriptures command us to do, and how they're anniversaries of the past, very romantic to Him. And they're also rehearsals of the future. They're a shadow of things to come in the future. They teach us His plan of salvation and what He's doing through humanity. So I hope we don't get feeble knees. And I want to take note, since, there's been this bashing of the feast days, even on the Israel Today by this article. I'm not going to quote the person or the article, but I'm sure there's a lot more than that floating around out there. But, if you go to Leviticus 23, you read an outline of all, He calls them His feast days. They're not Jewish feast days only. It never says that they're Jewish feast days. And so that's a comment that anti-Semitic, Christians, people have this agenda against the feast or the Sabbath. And they don't know they're anti-Semitic many times, but there's these roots that go back to church fathers that wanted to replace these feast days. And so there's a hatred and a bitterness that has been built up through generations of fighting and wars against the Jews and the Christians and the Crusaders. And it's a bloody history I don't want to get too much detail into, but we see that our Creator calls them His days. And we see that through the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul observing the fast. We call that Yom Kippur. He says, I won't sail to such and such a place till I keep Pentecost. I'm here in Jerusalem. I'm going to keep Pentecost. So we see the feast days. We see Paul doing a lot of things that most Christians don't realize he did throughout his ministry, including engaging in the sacrificial system in Jerusalem throughout his life and ministry as a believer. And I have a whole teaching on that. Not to earn salvation, but as a remembrance of what the Messiah had done, looking back, as remembrance, even as before the crucifixion, the sacrificial system was to look forward and to be a remembrance of what He's going to do in the future. So whether it be past or future, it's not wrong to do it when He commands it right when there's that temple, on the Temple Mount, not any old place. The Scriptures command us not to have sacrifices in any old place. I have a whole teaching on that. I don't want to get too much into that on YouTube as well. But when we change His feasts, when He calls them His, Then he kind of changes the terminology and calls them your feasts. When we make any changes that are contrary to his instructions, that are very clear in the scriptures, notice this in Isaiah 1, verses 13 through 15. And this is where a lot of Christianity says, see these feasts of the Lord, he doesn't like them anymore. But notice the terminology is different here in relation to Leviticus 23. It says, bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. Now, is incense abomination, which is symbolic of even prayers? No, he commanded these things. It's not that he hates them. Even sacrifices, like I said, Paul was engaging them. Even Nazirite vows, you see him taking in the book of Acts. Even a vow to not teach anything against Moses throughout his ministry. That's in Acts, I think it's 21, verses 20 through 24. Look at, James and the elders make him take this vow in Jerusalem with sacrifices and offerings and paying for 4 others. So it's not that he hates these things, but when we make changes or alterations against his instructions, notice this. He says, even the new moons and the Sabbaths and the calling of assemblies. Is it wrong to have ecclesias? Calling of assemblies and gatherings? No, those are commanded. Those are what he wants us to do. He says, I cannot endure the iniquity and the sacred meetings. Wow. He said, and this is where he says in verse 14, he says, your new moons and your appointed feasts. Key word here is your, not my. Creator's not saying my feast. He's saying yours. They are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing with them. He has a hard time bearing with them when we make them equal or higher than his feasts and instructions. He says, when you spread out your hands, I will hide from you. He's not going to hear your prayers if you're not doing it right in the way he instructs it. And if you're ignorant, you don't know. Okay? He has a lot of mercy and grace. Let me say that. But in ignorance, there's a lot more tolerance and patience. But as we learn, we should learn better and know better. He expects more of us. He says, even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Yeah, even blood. And what I propose to you is not just with ancient Israel or extremists in Judaism in early centuries, bloody history of murdering and persecuting the Christians, what we call Christians, but also mainstream Christian leaderships, especially since the 4th century CE with Constantine, Roman emperor who claims to become converted to Christianity and forces huge compromises, starting a whole new religion and claiming it's the 1st century religion, CE. Both sides are guilty of a lot of bloodshed. And not just a bloody history, but changing our Creator's feasts. His ordained feasts and his Sabbaths. For example, just real quickly, the Orthodox Judaism, they've changed the Creator's calendar to a degree. And I have a whole book on that, the Creator's Calendar. It's on Amazon, published. And it's just maybe a day or two. Most people, Messianics and Hebrews, like, it's not a big deal. I want unity. Unity's important, and community. Yes, it is. But 1 or 2 days, not a big deal. Well, Christianity says the same thing about the weekly Sabbaths. And they've changed the biblical weekly Sabbath to Sunday, with the death penalty to motivate, and has gotten most of Christianity to switch to the day of the sun god worship, claiming that Jesus was born, resurrected on Sunday morning on the first day. Well, that's true, but if you want to keep an anniversary of his resurrection, you have to go 3 days and 3 nights from the Passover. Easter. Look at the origins of Easter. It's all Babylonian and Greek theology. Bunnies laying eggs, colored eggs. And Easter can be sometimes 2, 3, or 4 weeks different away from Passover or Pesach. You got to go to the Hebrew Passover, Pesach, count 3 days, and it's not always a Sunday. If you want to keep the anniversary, to use Sunday as justification. Oh, well, he rose on that day, so I'm going to start keeping that as a Sabbath. And I'm not saying it's wrong to go to church on Sundays, Mondays, or any day of the week, but when you abolish what he has put in writing through his faithful prophets and all the apostles and even the Messiah, Yehoshua, aka Jesus, observed all these days. You go to Acts chapter 18, I think it's right around verse 4. Paul, every Sabbath day, went into the synagogues. You see Christian pastors doing that? Well, yeah, go to Sunday, but not many are going into the synagogues or into the congregations on the true Sabbath, on the biblical Sabbath. And I have another YouTube teaching, $1,000 reward for anyone who can prove that the weekly Sabbath was moved to Sunday in the first century in the scriptures by the writers of the first century, the apostles, as we call them, emissaries. Even Paul's writings. And I go to my YouTube teaching, $1,000 Sabbath reward. But anyway, both Christianity and Judaism have been guilty of so many of the same things, but in different ways. We're all guilty, and our Creator's trying to humble us. And hopefully we'll learn to love each other, because we've got to stop pointing that finger and say, you guys are guilty of that. Well, you point that finger, there's fingers pointing back at you. We're guilty of that. Our ancestors are guilty of that too. So let's learn to love each other. Let's get back to the faith, because Christianity and Judaism have polarized over the last 2 years, further away from each other doctrinally and in regard to feast days and his Moedims, as we say in Hebrew, his appointed, ordained times, which go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. Over 2,000 years before the Jewish people existed, our Creator made these days holy. He ordained them, foreordained them, and prophesied them from Genesis 1:14, when you understand that Hebrew correctly. And also in chapter 2, when he makes the weekly day to be different. He says holy simply means different, set apart. And then he gives instructions on how he wants us to do it differently. And I'm not saying we follow oral, Jewish law, the strict fence around the law, but simply what the scriptures clearly reveal. In Deuteronomy 30, it says these commandments are simple. You don't need highfalutin theologians to interpret it from you. You don't have to go across the seas and the oceans and some super duper seminaries or yeshiva schools, or, those are all good. I'm not saying they're bad, but I'm not saying you have to go to those to understand these and have more credibility over other people. And so it's easy to just quote church fathers or the sages and not think for yourself outside the box. And so we're all guilty of these things. Our ancestors are. And this is why even the Creator wrote that in Isaiah. Chapter 1. It's not just applying to Jewish people, but anyone who changes his instructions and his feasts. You notice in Amos chapter 5, 21 through 23 here. Here's the Creator speaking here, the holy name. Hashem, as we say, the name. He says, I despise your, key word is your, feast days. These are his words. And I do not savor your sacred assemblies. Your church services, your congregations, your synagogues, if you're making changes against his instructions, are trying to make them equal or more important than what we see in here, or abolishing things. 4 times we're warned in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, do not add or take away from these words. And at the end of Revelation it says, do not add or take away from these words of this book. And of course, Revelation, I think it's 14:12, says, here's the patience of the saints. They keep the commandments of Yah and have the testimony of Messiah. So you can't just have the gospel only. You have to have the commandments with it. That's the completeness. That's the fullness of the Gentiles, is having both the commandments and living the best we can. Of course, grace is where we slip up. He's very patient and merciful and forgiving. And also we have to have that testimony, that gospel that he brought of the kingdom. So, but notice here, continuing in Amos chapter 5 and verse 22, he says, though you offer me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, or say you want money offerings, you want to give a lot of money to the building or to the organization, he says, I will not accept them, nor will I regard your fat, he says, your fattened peace offerings. Of course, this is also specifically referring to the temple sacrificial system. But he says, take away from me the noise of your songs, for I will not hear the melody of your stringed instruments. So when we make changes, he calls them yours. But when you do it all for him, and you're in alignment with his instructions, and that's what simply Torah, if in case you didn't know, for you beginners out there and don't know Hebrew at all, Torah is not just law. People say law. It gives this negative connotation to it, but it simply means instructions. His instructions, his teachings, his doctrines. And so we can't, we got to be careful we're not changing them, or otherwise they're ours, not just his anymore. So in relation to, as I've said earlier, in relation to Elul 29, September through October, it's not over yet. As the old idiom says, it's not over till the lady sings. Or something like that. I might be missing a word in there, a negative word, but it's not over till the lady sings, okay? We're not at the end of the Shemitah year completely. These fall festivals are kind of like an overlapping. And the Jubilee was always kind of ended and started with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So we have these things beginning and ending, just like a day kind of fades in and fades out. We have kind of transitions kind of happening kind of slowly, and all of a sudden there's a bang sometimes, and that's what Jonathan Kahn is saying, that there's a shaking coming. But let's not get feeble knees just because it's not over yet. We're not even at the end of September. We still have October up here, what's coming up, which I'm going to get to. And as I said, if nothing crashes in the U.S. economy and or the U.S. soil here by the end of October 2015, Jonathan Kahn and many others like myself will eat humble pie. Because we have a strong feeling, and we're not saying that an angel or the Creator has spoken these things to us. We're not trying to make dogmatic prophecies, but based upon biblical patterns, biblical feasts, and the patterns that we've seen in U.S. history, also within Jewish history. We've seen some patterns that have been brought out. So beware of scoffers. Some of you who know the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, warns us of scoffers in the last days, mocking us, mocking his word and his prophecies. And remember, everything I said in part 1 video was based upon historical and biblical patterns, not dogmatic, prophecy. This is going to happen for sure on this day, but things to watch, things to look out for, remarkable patterns that have been happening in regard to our Creator's instructions, the Shemitah, USA history, like I said, and the U.S. becoming more and more seems to be against Israel, not supporting Israel as much as the past. So those are deadly combinations. Those are timing, what did he say, tick bomb, timing tick bomb situations, like a timing tick bomb or something to that terminology, another idiom here. Things can happen at any time. So as a result, remember, the fourth blood moon is a fuller eclipse. It's coming up here in California, West Coast, on Sunday evening, right after sunset, as I pointed out in part 1 of this video teaching. In Northern California, the full eclipse will be right around between 7:11 p.m. and 8:23 p.m. So it's going to be coming up. The moonrise here, the horizontal East Coast moonrise, the full moon will be coming up here in Northern California around 6:54 Pacific Standard Time. And again, that doesn't mean something's going to happen right on that day or shortly after that, but it's simply a harbinger, a warning. Could it mean blood coming from the east? I don't know. We'll see. But here's some patterns of the tetrad, history patterns. It's mostly in reference to the Jewish people. When you have 4 blood moons, they call it a tetrad, in 2 years, and all 4 of them land on biblical feasts. 2 of them on the Passover, and 2 of them on the Sukkot. Within a day or two. It's not like exact timing according to the Creator's calendar, every single one of them. But when these things have happened in the past, as Jonathan Kahn has pointed out, and Mark Biltz with Al Shaddai Ministries and others, that in 1966, 67, when there was one, it was the war, remember, in Israel, and Israel finally regained Jerusalem for the first time in almost 2,000 years. The time before that was 1947, 1948. Israel becomes a state for the first time in almost 2,000 years, a nation again. And as it says in Isaiah, can a nation be born in one day? It happened in one day. Of course, there was things leading up to that, a lot of bloodshed. In every one of these, tetrads, the Jewish people have had to endure a lot of bloodshed, a lot of catastrophe. And the one previous to 1947-48 was 1492 and 1493, the Spanish Inquisition. Many of you don't know much about that other than the Jews being kicked out of Spain, but it was a whole lot worse than that. Let me just put it at that. But it became a blessing, a lot of bloodshed for the Jewish people, but it kicked them out of Europe, got them to this free land over here where they can be blessed again and eventually end up on top. So it didn't happen exactly in those years, but we see the pattern of a lot of bloodshed upon the Jewish people, but they always end up on top eventually. And so that's the pattern that we see with the tetrads. I would say, is the big picture. And might be some bloody results for a lot of Jewish people, and that's where we need to be keeping the Torah. We need to be walking. Our Creator doesn't do anything without revealing it to His prophets first. And He likes to warn because He's so merciful, and He doesn't want us to go through horrible things. So again, I'm not setting dates of the return of the Messiah, and neither is Jonathan Kahn or any of us that are talking about this topic as I am in my video teachings as well. I'm not saying the end of the age is coming up this year. Neither is Jonathan Kahn, and neither are any other Mark Biltz. As far as I know, I haven't heard them saying it's the end of the age. It doesn't say it's the end of the world. But, what they have said, and I agree with, is we will see these patterns of harbingers and warnings to try to, get us to get back to the Word here and to become more faithful, more obedient, repent. We say in Hebrew, teshuvah. Return. Return to His way. As Yehoshua, a.k.a. Jesus, says, and we have him quoted in Luke 21:36, he says, watch, therefore, and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape these things to come. Yes, there is a way of escape. You don't have to just fear and be worried and stressed out about all this. If you have the faith, if you are walking in Him the best you can, the best you know how, if there's anything you know that's wrong, get it out. as Jonathan Kahn says, while you have the time. Repent. Teshuvah. In regard to the harbingers, the mystery of the Shemitah. Like I said, this 8th day, this final feast is coming up. We have Sukkot. It's still coming up as I record this video teaching. But as I hinted in the introduction, let me get into more detail with this, what I'm excited to share with you as a possibility. Again, the biggest 2-letter word is if, but if it's His will, look at the symbolism here of the great white throne judgment. That's what the 8th day, the feast, represents. And those of you who are not keeping the feasts out there, these annual feasts, no wonder the book of Revelation is confusing and hard to understand. For example, if you just go to Revelation chapters 19, 20, you see all the fall feasts happening in succession, the symbolic meanings. As Paul said, these are a shadow of things to come. You have the Feast of Trumpets. We say Yom Teruah, Feast of Trumpets, or Shofars, the 7th trumpet, the return of the Messiah from the clouds. And even Judaism, the Chabads, and a lot of the Hasidics, they know that the Messiah is coming on this day from the clouds, not as a man. And so a lot of things have been revealed to the ancient Hebrews that have still stuck from generation to this day, and they know this as well as the Messianics and Hebrew roots believers out there, that He's coming. A lot of churches of God know this too. And then Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the Messiah makes atonement after these 10 days of whatever's going on. Could be a wedding feast, could be, some battles, fighting against the Messiah and His saints. Whatever happens, He's finally going to bring restitution, an atonement, and the adversary, you see him locked up. An angel will grab him, a mighty angel will grab him and lock him in the bottomless pit, as it's symbolic of. And even in Yom Kippur, the goat that's led off into the wilderness is bound and by a fit man, it says, a very fit, strong man. So it's a lot of parallels that we see here, and we see that Messiah, his blood was shed for us, the goat that's slaughtered. That's symbolic of Messiah. Absolutely, His sins cover us. They cleanse us. They purify us. They make atonement for us. And even the sages, a lot of Judaism doesn't know this today, but the sages knew that blood was atonement for sin. It's in the Talmuds, and it's even in a lot of the ancient writings of the sages. So we should understand that correctly. Then Sukkot is symbolic of this 1,000-year millennium, just like the weekly Sabbath. And then the 8th day is this great white throne judgment, where there's another resurrection of condemnation. And so you can read about that in Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. Sorry about that. Let me clear my throat. Revelation 20 onward, you'll see after the judgment, there is a new creation, new beginnings. We call the 8th day. 8 in the scriptures has to do with new beginnings. There's so many 8s. Even circumcision on the 8th day has to do with new beginnings and cleansing and spiritual symbolism there for restoration and revival of His way, His truth. So, with Judgment Day, and some of that being a part of it, could something catastrophic happen on U.S. economy or soil on October? That would be October 6th, according to the Creator's calendar. The modern Jewish calendar has it October 5th, 2015 CE. Not saying or predicting something will happen on that day, but if it does, don't say it's just a coincidence. It could even happen during the Feast of Sukkot, those 7 days. The 1989 earthquake even happened during Sukkot. I was out, and those in the Bay Area and Northern California who were observing Sukkot and traveled out of the Bay Area didn't experience it. And that's how we remember and know, many of us who were keeping the feast at that time, that sometimes these things happen in timings, and he protects his people who are keeping these feast days. And whether you're in the Bay Area or not, that's, it shouldn't really matter. You shouldn't fear if you're here. But his timing is his timing, and we shouldn't try to force it and predict it unless he is really making it crystal clear or speaking it to us, giving us some visions. And I'm not saying I've had that, like I've mentioned before. But it's interesting to note the potential timing, the potential, like I said, prophecy possibilities that are still yet to come, if he wills. He may want to put a stamp of approval on certain days. But please, regardless, let your faith be strong, as I've also said, with fervent prayers for good timing and divine protection for everyone and everything, according to his will and his ways. Repent of whatever we can while we have time. Get things out of our minds, out of our hearts, out of our lives, out of our actions that are not in alignment with his clear instructions, so that we can be clean as we possibly can. We can be faithful doers of the word. Doers. Not just hearers of the word, but doers of the word. And that way, Psalms 91, always keep that in your memory. Remember, it should be a big memory verse here. I've quoted that, being under his wings, 1,000 may fall on this side, 10,000 on that side. We can have that faith, no matter where we're at, no matter what happens. And don't get discouraged if he's not hearing your prayers, if he's not protecting you when the time comes. Just have that peace, that inner faith that his will is always the best. All things work out for good for those who love him, truly love him, and are called according to his purpose. And as Yeshua said, we shouldn't have to worry too much about these things happening on Sabbath, his days, except for maybe, the Judgment Day one coming at the end. But, Yeshua said in similarity, in relative, as we see in Matthew chapter 24:20. Let me repeat that again in conclusion. He says, pray that your flight be not in the winter or on a Sabbath. Wow, a winter or a Sabbath. A lot of Christians, whoa, Jesus is supporting the Sabbath? He's still commanding Sabbath observance? Yep, didn't change it. Some people say, after 70 AD and the destruction of the temple, that's when the flight happened, and he was just talking to the Jewish people only in Matthew 24. Are you saying Matthew 24 only applies to Jewish people? Just throw that out, cross it out of your Bibles then if you're not Jewish? Didn't Thomas Jefferson cross scriptures out, even tear pages out? Do you want to be guilty of the same thing and say that's just Jewish only? No, he said pray. Man has no authority, no power to change the winters, the timing of the winters. So the implication he's alluding to, man has no power or authority to change the timing of his Sabbaths, his Shabbats, his feasts, as we can read all of them in Leviticus 23 in more detail. So regardless of what happens or what doesn't happen in September, October, don't let it be a mocking or a downplay on his feasts. That's, I think, should be a big picture statement that I hope everyone can remember in this video teaching. And let us continually lift up fervent prayers as righteous men and women and make changes to help make revival of truth and his way, in helping bring truth to the nations as we have time before the catastrophic things happen. As Elijah, had that faith, and he had human nature just like you and me. And so did all the other prophets. None of them were perfect, except for the prophet like unto Moshe. That was Messiah, who became that perfect sacrifice. But, in regard to the harbingers, in the Shemitah years, let us remember it's not over. Right now as I speak, it's not over till the lady sings. And nothing big or bad has to happen to the U.S. economy. If it doesn't, then, like I said, by the end of October, then I've got a lot of humble pie. I'll do another video teaching, and I'll even take out some pie, and I'll eat it in front of it and say, hey, apologize for being so confident and realize that we all need to eat humble pie in one degree or another, but it takes humility to do that, and I'm willing to do that, and do a part 3 on this video teaching. And so, stay tuned, be watchful, and pray fervently. And shalom, have that peace always. Shalom in the name of Yehoshua. Yeshua, aka Jesus, because he is salvation.